What's up, guys, and welcome back. In my last video, if you could tolerate it, I whined endlessly about how unexcited I was to review this camera, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II. And what I meant by that, if I wasn't clear, is that there aren't a lot of things that I can show this camera doing that no other camera can do, which is unusual for a top of the line, expensive, newly released camera. And but boy, was I wrong about that, because on my very first outing with the camera, I saw it do all kinds of wild things that I've never seen any camera do. So buckle in and I'll tell you how the Canon R5 Mark II failed to clear even the incredibly low bar of expectations that I held for it to be the worst camera that I've ever used. All right, so I don't normally do first impressions videos. I don't find them to be that valuable, and I typically will try to use a product a few times over the course of a few weeks before I review it. But there are just some information that I gleaned from using this the first time that I really feel like I need to share. I'm gonna tell you about some debilitating failures that I experienced with the camera and some frustrations, and answer some questions that have been asked in the comments of my introductory video. So stay tuned for that, but I think the best way to tackle this is to sort of go in chronological order of my experience, starting with getting the camera. I got the camera on the day that I was scheduled to shoot an event. This is a Latin culture festival in my hometown. I shoot the event pro bono, and the event organizers pay me a modest sum to run a social media campaign. So I hadn't intended to shoot this, but it arrived on the day of the event. In fact, it arrived while I was volunteering to help set up for the event. And I rushed home, thinking I would grab the camera and go back to the event, but it arrived with a fully discharged battery. And so the first order of business was to get the battery on the battery charger. I went back to finish helping set up the event. And when I came back a couple hours later, the battery was only charged to 50% capacity. So I ended up needing to take the battery charger and plug it into an inverter on my car. And I went to the event with this camera and my R7, which was the camera that I intended to shoot the event on. An hour later, the battery was still not fully charged. It was blinking 3 out of 4 blinks, so 75% charged. The camera, fortunately, is backwards compatible with all of Canon's previous full-frame mirrorless camera bodies, the LP-E6 series battery, although it does come with a new LP-E6P battery, which is the fourth iteration of this battery. I'll get more into the battery later. The point is, I threw in my R7 battery, the LP-E6NH, to set up the camera, right, to try to get the settings right, because I know there are a lot of things that I have to change to get a new camera shooting. I shoot with new cameras pretty frequently. So aside from the fact that it was taking the battery forever to charge, this was my first frustration. I've probably set up a dozen different Canon cameras. I've never had as much trouble setting up, I don't think, maybe even any product that I've ever had to set up. I was Googling how to do things on this camera.
I must admit, though, that setting up the R5 Mark II is not an easy task, and it took me a few days to fine-tune all the settings to get the results that I wanted.
So I know first thing I've got to go into the menus and set it up to shoot raw photos, because for whatever reason, a $5,000 camera comes set up to shoot JPEGs only. So there are these 2 different menus for setting up the JPEG and HEIF image quality, and one to turn on raw shooting, but then also to set the size of the JPEG or HEIFs. It's called image type / size. And then I'm trying to figure out how to set this thing up for C-Log, and there's not a menu setting to turn C-Log on and off. You got to go into something called a CP menu, which I think stands for custom picture profile. And then you've got to assign C-Log to a picture profile and then set the camera to that profile. But when you do that, you don't only assign the gamma, you also have to assign a color gamut to the profile, right? So it's possible that I could be shooting in C-Log 3 and then decide to switch out of the Canon Cinema color gamut, and then need to switch over to C-Log 2 and then end up inadvertently in a completely different color gamut, because these things all change at the same time. Anyway, new menus, super confusing, huge fail. I switch on the camera and go try to use it with the LP-E6NH battery, because the LP-E6P battery is still charging after 3 hours. And I know from the research I did before buying the camera that, like every new battery iteration, there are some limitations involved with using the previous generation battery. For example, when the R5 came out with the LPE6 NH battery, you couldn't charge the camera through the USB-C and record at the same time, right? I get that, that makes sense. The camera also warns you about limitations when you turn it on with the LPE6 NH battery every time. And if you read the technical documentation, you can see that there are limitations to, yes, in stills mode, to like the frame rates. There are limitations on some of the niche new video features, right? Whatever. And it says that there are limitations to recording modes above 30 frames per second. But what I did not expect is you actually are locked into 30 frames per second and 30 frames per second only. So for example, you can't shoot 23:9:7 or 24 or 25. You're locked out of C-Log. You can't shoot anything above 4K, right? Basically, when you turn this camera on with an LPE6NH battery, it's essentially a toy camera. And that is extremely frustrating because you can't buy the batteries for this camera. This camera will record until the battery dies, and then you've got like 3 hours of a toy camera while your one battery charges. Why an $80 battery that's this big takes 3 hours to charge when like the battery that's this big that powers my power tools only takes a couple hours to charge, when my whole MacBook takes less than 2 hours to charge? I don't know. It's a subject of fascination to me. So to digress briefly on the batteries, because since that day and today, the batteries came back in stock. I don't know how long they'll be back in stock. If it's anything like the stock on the camera, I wouldn't count on them being in stock for long, but I did check today and the batteries were still available. I now have 3 LPE6P batteries, and I decided this morning to run some tests so I'd have a little more information to give on this video. So I set up the R5 Mark II and the R7 on tripods in my living room and pointed them at my TV so they could face track YouTube videos. They seem to have a pretty good time doing that, so that I could discharge the batteries. But in so doing, A, I got this excellent piece of wildlife video. And B, again, I just wanted to discharge the batteries, but so I was running both cameras at 4K 60 doing face tracking autofocus. And just in case you're interested, the R7 recorded for 2 hours and 10 minutes to discharge an LPE6P battery. The R5 Mark II ran for 1 hour and 23 minutes. So 47 minutes longer record time on the R7 than the R5 Mark II. But after I stopped recording, I realized the R5 Mark II had actually been running in 24 frames per second the whole time, not 60 frames per second. So the R7 Mark, and not the 4K fine mode either. This was like the line skipped 24 frames per second. So the R7 will actually record for 47 minutes. Is that right? For 47 minutes longer in 60 frames per second than the R5 Mark II will in 24 frames per second. And then when I finished discharging the batteries, I put them in 3 different battery chargers. So I charged one on a third-party generic rapid charger, I charged one in the camera, and I charged one in the supplied Canon charger, the one that comes with the camera. And like within the margin of error and the accuracy of my testing, they all charged in about 3 hours. So what's so annoying about this to me is not just that I have to buy all new Canon batteries for my Canon camera system, although that really sucks. And it's also not just that I've got like 1 hour and 23 minutes of recording time, after which for 3 hours, this becomes essentially a toy camera, a $5,000 toy camera. What really annoys me is that I can't spend any amount of money to change that. As of now anyway, until Canon catches up its battery supply, you've got a $5,000 camera for 1 hour and a half, and then for 3 hours, you've got a toy camera. Can you even see this? Okay, but you know, even after I finally got the camera set up to do basic shooting, and I finally got the battery charged well enough that it was not just a toy camera, right? I could actually record with it, and shoot with it to its full capability, or really just like a basic standard of capability. None of that prepared me for what happened once I started using the camera. So first off, I should say that I had the camera set up just like I do now. I'm using an old generation adapted third-party DSLR lens. This is like the Mark I version of the Tamron 24 to 70 2.8. I'm using not the fastest, but an Angelbird 1 terabyte CF Express Type B card. And let's see, I've also got a Lexar Gold 128 gig V90 UHS-2 SD card, and I'm using the Canon battery. So like, I don't know what it is about the configuration or if it's a problem with the camera itself, but maybe an hour into shooting this event, when I would go to turn it on in video mode, the screen would be just completely black. This was the weirdest thing I've ever seen any camera do. The screen would be completely black, but the overlays, such as the autofocus and the camera settings, would still be displayed on the screen. The autofocus box would move around as if it was tracking something. If I hit record, the camera would record a video clip. I just couldn't see what the camera was recording. If I put the camera into stills mode, the camera would work fine for shooting stills. Sometimes when I would put it back into video mode from stills mode, it would start working normally, and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes it would go right back to the black screen. Sometimes I would turn the camera off and turn it back on, and it would fix the issue. Sometimes I would turn the camera off and turn it back on, and it would go back to the black screen. Sometimes this black screen was an insane looking, weird, pixelated, like TV static green screen. But what really irritated me the most about this was that this was eventually became to be more the rule than the exception. More times I would turn on the camera to shoot a video clip and have the black screen or the green screen and have no way of being able to see what I was shooting, and sort of like aim the camera at something till the autofocus box came on and hit record and hope that that was kind of what I was hoping to shoot at. Right, that happened more often than I would turn on the camera and it would just work normally. I don't know what to say about that. Canon did announce a firmware update that is supposed to fix a vaguely, among many other bugs, supposed to fix a vaguely worded problem that sounds like it could have been this problem. But importantly, when I turned the camera on this morning to do that battery draining that I told you about, I assiduously tried to recreate this problem and could not. So I don't really have any confidence that if I replaced the firmware and I turned the camera on and it was working perfectly, that this issue wouldn't return, because I can't get it to recreate the problem. I don't know what's up with that, but I do know you can't shoot an event if you can't see the screen. And for that reason, not all the other complaints, some of which are nitpicky, some of which are actually really frustrating and could be, could have an impact on the way a person uses a camera, especially that battery stuff, right? The camera is unusable if it doesn't have a screen. And for that reason, I've decided that the R5 Mark II is officially, and in fact, far and away, the worst camera that I've ever used. And I have no other way to say it. So if you have watched my camera reviews over the last couple of years, you know that the thing I value most in a camera is reliability and dependability. You're gonna find out that this is one of the most rock solid, reliable, enjoyable cameras that you can get. And this camera is like the most utter dependability fail that I've ever had. I hate to be a negative Nancy about it. No, I wasn't super excited about this camera, but I was hoping that it would at least be sort of a partner in making creative work for maybe the next few years, and now I can't even say that. So I don't know what to make of it. I'm gonna keep testing it. I'm not gonna give up on it. Stay tuned and I'll let you know if I have any further problems with it. I'm gonna update the firmware probably today. I'll keep you guys posted, but this is stuff that I definitely think that you should know if you're considering buying the R5 Mark II. Thanks for listening to my experiences. If you got questions, I said that I would answer questions. Okay. Roger Zool says, thanks for giving us your gripe session. Heard that. Sorry you were so unexcited about buying an expensive camera. Roger, I get that comment. I really do. I understand it is a privilege to be able to buy expensive cameras. I would only say that I use these cameras for work. I need them to work, and purchasing this camera actually represented an enormous amount of my work budget for probably the remainder of 2024, but I get it. Maybe aside from working photography, I also enjoy photography, and maybe I should take a little bit more time to appreciate that I have access to these nice cameras. Someone wants to know if they can see a comparison of R7 and R5 II footage regarding cropping. That's a really good question because the R7 has a 33 megapixel sensor and it's already cropped. The R5 Mark II has a 45 megapixel sensor, but it's full frame. In fact, the crop area of the R7 is probably more pixel dense than the R5 Mark II. Subscribe and let's do some more in-depth testing on that. I'd like to see that as well. And lastly, Delves Photos says, if I'm so unexcited by the R5 II, why not buy the R5 Mark I instead and save some money and maybe experience less buyer's remorse? And I think that's a good idea for a lot of photography applications. The R5 Mark II is still a really good camera. It could be, but I also need this to plug in and perform a generous role in video production. And without getting super elaborate into the reasons that the R5 Mark I is not an appropriate camera for that, suffice it to say at least that it stops recording after 30 minutes. So, right, among other things, it doesn't suit all the needs that I have for a camera. And I'm so glad that Canon did finally release a camera that can suit those needs. Hopefully with some firmware updates, we get that squared away. And if you want to see how well the camera does in the video use case, especially with improvements like C-Log 2, 4K 120 frames per second shooting, let me show you. See you guys next time. Bye.